Take the cursed one, Thomas Whitmore said, pushing his daughter forward as though she were a debt he could finally afford to pay. Emma stumbled into the snow, the silver chains around her wrists chiming softly in the frozen silence. Hundreds of wolves stood beneath the bare trees of Stonefang Altar, their breath rising in pale clouds beneath the full moon. No one spoke. No one moved. At the top of the ancient stone steps sat Adrian Blackwood, Alpha King of Nightcrest, dressed in a black coat fastened with a silver wolf at the throat. He looked exactly as the stories described him, tall, still, and impossible to read. Emma kept her eyes lowered. She had learned long ago that looking powerful men in the face only gave them another reason to punish her pride. Whitmore Pack has no gold left, her father continued. No soldiers. No land worth taking. But this daughter carries the mark that ruined our bloodline. Accept her as tribute, your majesty, and consider our debt fulfilled. A murmur passed through the gathering. Cursed daughter. The words followed Emma everywhere. They had been whispered behind doors, spoken over dinner tables, and carved into the lonely shape of her life. The pale silver mark that curled from her left wrist toward her shoulder had appeared when she was 6 years old. After that, candles burned white when she entered a room. Injured animals gathered near her window. Her family had called it darkness because they had never understood the light. Now they had dressed her in a thin white gown, bound her hands, and brought her 30 miles through winter cold to offer her to a king they feared. Emma lifted her chin at last. If this sacrifice spared the children of her pack from hunger, she would endure whatever came next. Adrian rose. The scrape of his boots against stone sounded louder than the wind. He descended one step at a time, his silver eyes fixed on the mark visible beneath the chain around Emma's wrist. The closer he came, the quieter the wolves became. Thomas bowed lower. She has brought misfortune to every home that sheltered her, he warned. Keep the chains on. Adrian stopped in front of Emma. For one terrible second she expected disgust. Instead, his expression changed. Not with fear. With recognition. Who placed these on her? He asked. His voice was calm, but every wolf at the altar lowered their head. Thomas hesitated. I did, your majesty. Adrian reached for Emma's bound hands. His touch was warm, careful, and strangely familiar. The moment his fingers brushed the silver mark, every torch around the altar turned white. Gasps moved through the crowd. Emma stared at the flames, her heartbeat suddenly louder than the wind. Adrian looked from the fire to her face, then did something no Alpha King had done before anyone in living memory. He lowered himself onto one knee in the snow. Remove her chains, he commanded. Thomas looked up in shock. Adrian never took his eyes from Emma. You did not bring me a curse, he said. You brought me the woman this kingdom has been waiting for. Then he turned toward the gathered wolves, his voice carrying across the frozen altar. Rise, Emma Whitmore. They are kneeling before their queen. Hours before the white flames rose around Stonefang Altar, Emma Whitmore had been kneeling beside a wounded fox behind the small cottage where her family kept her hidden. Snow pressed cold through the knees of her faded dress, but she barely noticed. The animal trembled beneath her hands, its amber eyes wide with fear. You are safe, she whispered. I will not let them find you. A pale warmth moved through her palms. It was never bright enough to hurt, never wild enough to frighten her. It felt like moonlight resting on still water. The fox stopped trembling. Its breathing softened, and the small cut along its paw slowly closed. Emma smiled as it rose, tested its weight, then disappeared between the snow-covered pines. Behind her, a candle burned inside the cottage window. Its ordinary yellow flame turned white. Emma quickly pulled her sleeves over the silver mark curling from her left wrist. She had learned to hide every sign of what she could do. Margaret Whitmore called it proof of corruption. Thomas Whitmore called it a family disgrace. The rest of the pack simply called Emma cursed. Since childhood, she had been forbidden from attending moon ceremonies, harvest feasts, and public gatherings. Her room stood nearly half a mile behind the main house, far enough that visitors would never know Thomas had an eldest daughter. Food arrived in a basket twice each week. Books came only when Claire secretly left them beneath the cedar tree. Yet the lonely cottage never felt entirely empty. Birds gathered on the roof during storms. Deer rested beside the porch. Injured animals somehow found their way to her door, as though the forest understood what her own family refused to see. That morning, Emma had shared her last loaf of bread with 2 children from the village. Their mother had been sick, and their pantry was bare. "Do not tell anyone where you got it," Emma warned gently. The younger boy frowned. "Why does everyone say you bring bad luck?" Emma had looked toward the distant chimney of the Whitmore house. People sometimes fear what they do not understand. By sunset, a servant arrived with a white gown folded over one arm and silver chains hanging from the other. He would not meet her eyes. "Your father requests your presence at the main house." Emma knew at once that something had changed. Thomas had not requested her presence in 12 years. Inside his study, Margaret stood beside the fireplace while Claire waited near the door, pale and frightened. A royal letter rested open on the desk. Thomas did not invite Emma to sit. "Nightcrest has demanded payment before midnight," he said. "If we fail, Whitmore Pack loses its land and protection." Margaret's gaze moved over Emma with cold satisfaction. The Alpha King needs a tribute worthy of the debt. Emma looked at the gown, then at the chains. Claire shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "No, there must be another way." Thomas remained silent. That silence answered everything. Emma's chest tightened, but she thought of the children who had eaten her bread that morning. She thought of the elderly families who would not survive another winter without shelter. Slowly she extended her hands. "Tell the king I will go." The servant fastened the silver restraints with trembling hands, careful not to touch the mark beneath Emma's sleeve. Margaret watched from beside the fireplace, her expression calm enough to make the room feel colder. Thomas signed the royal document without reading it again. Only Claire moved closer. She slipped a small silver hairpin into Emma's palm, the one their mother had worn in the only portrait Emma still remembered. "You do not have to do this," Claire whispered. Emma closed her fingers around the pin. "Someone does." Outside, the village bell rang 6 times. Less than an hour remained before the royal procession reached Stonefang Altar. Emma expected guards from Nightcrest. Instead, a black carriage waited beneath the bare elm trees, bearing no royal crest. A tall man in a dark gray coat stood beside it. His hair was silver at the temples, and his smile was polished but empty. "Victor Hale," he introduced himself, "advisor to His Majesty." His eyes settled on Emma's covered wrist for a moment too long. "So this is the daughter." Margaret stepped forward quickly. "The cursed one, as promised." Victor's smile deepened. "Words have power, Mrs. Whitmore. Be careful which ones you choose." Emma felt something uneasy beneath his courtesy, a chill that had nothing to do with winter. Before she entered the carriage, shouting rose near the eastern cottages. Smoke curled above the rooftops. A small kitchen fire had spread to a wooden awning, and villagers rushed through the snow with buckets. Then a child cried out from inside. Emma recognized the voice. It was the younger boy who had eaten her bread that morning. She pulled away from the servant and ran toward the cottage. "Stop her," Margaret ordered, but no one moved fast enough. Heat pressed against Emma as she reached the doorway. The smoke made her eyes water, yet beneath the fear she sensed something familiar, like a frightened animal calling for help. The silver mark beneath her sleeve grew warm. "Ethan," she called. "Follow my voice." A white glow moved from her fingertips into the air. The flames along the doorway softened, bending away from her path without touching her dress. She found the boy crouched behind a table, clutching a wooden toy wolf. Emma wrapped her cloak around him and guided him outside. The moment they crossed into the snow, the fire returned to its ordinary golden color. The villagers stared. Some crossed their arms over their chests. Others stepped back. Ethan's mother rushed forward and held him tightly. "She saved him," Claire said, her voice breaking through the silence. Margaret's face hardened. "She caused it." Her curse answered her. Emma looked at the woman she had called family, and understood that no proof would ever be enough for people committed to fearing her. Behind them, Victor Hale watched the last white spark disappear from Emma's hand. For the first time, his perfect expression cracked. Not with surprise, with recognition. He approached the carriage and opened the door himself. "We must leave now," he said quietly. Emma climbed inside, still holding her mother's hairpin. As the village disappeared behind them, Victor took a small black stone from his pocket. A pale light pulsed once beneath its surface. He closed his hand around it and smiled into the darkness. "At last," he whispered. "The mark has awakened." The carriage rolled through the forest as twilight deepened, its wheels grinding over frozen ruts while bare branches scraped softly against the roof. Emma sat with her hands folded in her lap, the silver restraints cold against her skin. Across from her, Victor Hale watched the dark road through the window, his black stone hidden once more inside his coat. He had not spoken since leaving the village, but his silence felt deliberate, as though he were waiting for her to ask the wrong question. Emma looked down at her mother's hairpin resting between her fingers. It was the only thing she had been allowed to carry. "Did the king ask for me by name?" she asked at last. Victor turned slowly. "His Majesty asked for payment." "That was not my question." A faint smile touched his mouth. "No. He did not ask for you by name." Emma expected the answer to hurt, but it brought an unexpected calm. Adrian Blackwood had not chosen her for this. Her family had. Whatever waited at Stonefang altar, she would not confuse his authority with their betrayal. The carriage climbed higher into the mountains. Through the window, Emma saw torchlight flickering between the trees, then the outline of ancient stone pillars rising from the snow. Dozens of wolves had already gathered around the altar in human form, dressed in winter cloaks marked with the crests of their packs. At the top of the steps stood a dark wooden chair beneath a carved arch of intertwined wolves. The throne was empty. "We are early," Emma said. "The king is never early," Victor replied. "He arrives when everyone else has learned to wait." The carriage stopped. A servant opened the door and cold air swept inside. Emma stepped down carefully. Her thin white gown offered little protection from the wind, but she kept her shoulders straight. She could feel the crowd studying her. Some looked curious. Others looked away as though misfortune might pass through a glance. Thomas, Margaret, and Claire arrived moments later in a second carriage. Claire moved toward Emma at once, but Margaret caught her arm. "You have done enough," Margaret murmured. Claire's eyes filled with helpless anger. Emma gave her a small nod. It was not forgiveness. It was reassurance. She would not let Claire's fear become another chain. Thomas approached with the royal document held tightly against his chest. "When the king arrives, you will kneel," he said. "You will not speak unless he commands it." Emma met his eyes. "And if he asks why you brought me?" Thomas looked toward the altar. "I will tell him the truth." "Whose truth?" He had no answer. A deep horn sounded from beyond the trees. Every conversation stopped. The crowd turned toward the northern path as black horses emerged through the falling snow. Royal guards rode in two silent lines, their silver emblems catching the torchlight. At their center came Adrian Blackwood, mounted on a tall black horse, his posture still and commanding beneath a dark coat. Emma felt the air change before he even reached the altar. It was not fear alone. It was recognition moving through the wolves around her, instinctive and immediate. Adrian dismounted and climbed the stone steps without looking left or right. Then he turned toward the gathering. His silver eyes passed over Thomas, Margaret, and Victor. Finally they found Emma. The mark beneath her sleeve grew warm. One by one, the torches nearest the altar flickered from gold to white. The white flame spread from torch to torch until the entire altar glowed like a field of frozen stars. Emma heard the crowd draw a single breath, but Adrian Blackwood did not look at the fire. His silver eyes remained fixed on her. Thomas stepped forward and bowed, presenting the royal document with both hands. "Your Majesty, Whitmore Pack has come to settle its debt." Adrian accepted the parchment without opening it. "With chains." His gaze lowered to Emma's wrists. Thomas hesitated. "My daughter carries an affliction. The restraints are for your protection." The silver mark beneath Emma's sleeve burned warmer, not with pain but with a strange awareness. Adrian descended the steps. Each footfall seemed to quiet the forest around him. Victor Hale moved nearer to the altar, watching carefully from behind the royal guards. "The girl was offered freely," Victor said. "The terms appear lawful." Adrian stopped several feet from Emma. "Did you come freely?" The question unsettled her more than a command would have. No one had asked what she wanted. Not her father. Not Margaret. Not even the villagers who would benefit from her sacrifice. Emma glanced at Claire, whose face was pale beneath the torchlight, then at the families gathered beyond the altar. She remembered empty cupboards, cold cottages, and a child calling for help through smoke. I chose to protect people who had no part in this decision, Emma answered. That is not the same as choosing to belong to anyone. A murmur moved through the gathering. Thomas stiffened. Margaret looked horrified that Emma had spoken without permission. Adrian remained still, but something in his expression softened. No, he said. It is not. He reached for her hands. Emma fought the instinct to step back. His touch was careful, almost reverent, as his fingers rested against the metal around her wrists. The moment his skin brushed the silver mark, the altar disappeared. For one breath, Emma stood beneath a different moon. A woman with chestnut hair faced a black wolf larger than any natural creature. White fire circled them without heat. The wolf lowered its head, not in defeat but in trust. Then the vision vanished. Emma swayed. Adrian steadied her by the forearm, his own composure shaken for the first time. You saw it, she whispered. Yes. His answer was meant only for her. Behind them, Victor's hand slipped inside his coat. Adrian turned toward Thomas. Who taught you to call this mark a curse? Margaret answered before her husband could speak. Everyone knows what she is. Adrian looked at her until the confidence drained from her face. Then he closed one hand around the silver restraint. The ancient lock opened with a clear metallic snap. He removed the chains and placed them on the altar as though they were evidence of a crime. His dark cloak followed, settling around Emma's shoulders and shielding her from the winter wind. She is not your payment, he said to Thomas. She is under the protection of the crown. Emma looked up at him. Protection can become another prison. Adrian met her gaze without offense. Then the doors will remain open. He turned toward the gathered wolves and lowered himself onto one knee before her. The forest went silent. Rise, Emma Whitmore, he said. No one here will ever force you to kneel again. Behind the royal guards, the black stone in Victor Hale's pocket began to glow. By dawn, the road to Nightcrest had vanished beneath fresh snow. Emma rode inside the royal carriage with Adrian seated across from her, his dark cloak still wrapped around her shoulders. Neither spoke for several miles. The silence was not uncomfortable, but it carried questions too large for either of them to answer. Emma watched the mountains rise beyond the window, their peaks silver beneath the morning light. Why did you call me queen? She asked at last. Adrian's gaze shifted from the passing forest to her face. Because the mark you carry once belonged to the women who ruled beside my ancestors. Once belonged. Their history was erased. His voice grew quieter. I was taught they disappeared centuries ago. Emma looked down at the pale design curling along her wrist. My family taught me it brought ruin. Families can preserve lies as carefully as kingdoms do. Before she could reply, Nightcrest Citadel appeared through the snowfall, built into the side of a black mountain. Tall towers rose above the valley, their windows glowing gold against the stone. Hundreds of people waited beyond the gates, servants, guards, advisors, and nobles dressed in winter colors. The moment Emma stepped from the carriage, whispers followed her across the courtyard. That is the tribute, one woman murmured. The Whitmore girl, another replied. She does not look like a queen. Emma kept walking. She had survived years of harsher words spoken by people whose approval had once mattered. These strangers could not wound what her family had already forced her to rebuild. Adrian remained beside her, never touching her, yet close enough that no one dared block her path. Inside the great hall, polished stone reflected the light of 100 chandeliers. A silver-haired woman approached them with measured grace. Eleanor Blackwood, Adrian said. My father's sister. Eleanor studied Emma's face, then the mark beneath her sleeve. Her expression revealed neither welcome nor rejection. The old records must be opened, she said, before the court invents its own truth. A sudden crash interrupted the murmurs. Near the far wall, a young servant had dropped a tray and fallen to his knees. His face had gone pale, and one hand pressed against his side. The nobles stepped away from him as though weakness were contagious. Emma moved before anyone could stop her. She knelt beside the boy and spoke softly. What is your name? Samuel, he whispered. I cannot catch my breath. Emma placed one hand over his and the other against his shoulder. The familiar warmth stirred beneath her palms. White light appeared between her fingers, gentle as candlelight. Samuel's breathing slowed. Color returned to his face. When he looked up, his fear had vanished. Thank you, he said. The hall had become completely silent. Emma helped him stand, then noticed Adrian watching from the foot of the stairs. There was no fear in his silver eyes now, only certainty. They told me your power brought misfortune, he said. Emma glanced at Samuel, who was already breathing easily. They were wrong. Adrian looked toward the gathered court. Yes, he said. And now everyone here knows it. Across the hall, Victor Hale slipped through a narrow doorway, the black stone glowing beneath his coat. The great hall remained silent after Samuel returned to his feet, but the silence had changed. It no longer held mockery. It held uncertainty. Emma could feel dozens of eyes following her as Adrian crossed the polished floor and stopped beside her. You should rest, he said. You have traveled all night. Before Emma could answer, the chandeliers above them flickered. Their golden flames dimmed, then bent toward the narrow doorway where Victor Hale had disappeared. A low vibration moved through the stone beneath Emma's shoes. Adrian turned sharply. Clear the hall. His command carried across the room with effortless authority. The nobles began moving toward the exits, but the black stone hidden beyond the doorway pulsed again. This time Adrian caught his breath. His hand closed around the railing beside him, and his silver eyes darkened. Emma felt the change before she understood it. The air became heavy with fear that did not belong to the court. It came from Adrian himself, buried beneath years of control. Eleanor stepped forward. The old curse, she whispered. Adrian straightened, fighting whatever force pressed against him. Take everyone outside. His voice was rougher now but still controlled. The royal guards formed a path toward the doors. Emma remained where she was. You should go, Adrian told her. No, his gaze found hers. Emma, you opened the doors for me. I will not leave you trapped behind yours. Another pulse moved through the hall. Shadows gathered along the walls, not threatening anyone, but folding inward as though the room itself had become afraid. Adrian lowered his head, his breathing uneven. The nobles who remained near the exits watched from a distance, too frightened to come closer. Emma approached slowly. Tell me what you feel. It is not safe. That is not what I asked. His eyes lifted. For the first time she saw the man beneath the crown, not cold or commanding, but exhausted from carrying something no one else understood. It feels like every fear I have ever buried is being returned at once, he said. Emma stopped within arm's reach. The silver mark along her wrist glowed through her sleeve. Then you do not have to carry it alone. Adrian stepped back. Do not touch me. Because you might hurt me? Because I do not know what this curse will show you. Emma thought of the years she had spent hidden from the moon, of every person who had called her dangerous without ever asking whether she was afraid. I know what it is to be judged by something inside you, she said. Let me see. She raised her hand. Adrian's breath caught, but he did not retreat again. Emma rested her palm against his chest. White light spread beneath her fingers, gentle and warm. The shadows stopped moving. In an instant, Emma saw a child standing alone in a vast throne room, listening as advisors told him kindness was weakness. She saw Adrian learning to silence every feeling until the silence became a prison. Then another image appeared. Victor Hale stood beneath the citadel many years earlier, placing the black stone inside an ancient chamber. Emma opened her eyes. Adrian's breathing steadied. Across the hall, the narrow doorway slammed shut. Victor, she whispered. Adrian looked toward it, understanding dawning in his silver eyes. This was never my curse, he said. Emma's white light brightened. No, it was his chain. Adrian crossed the great hall toward the narrow doorway, and Emma followed with Eleanor and 2 royal guards close behind. The passage beyond was colder than the rest of the citadel. White stone walls descended beneath the mountain, marked with faded symbols that matched the silver pattern on Emma's wrist. With every step, the black stone pulsed somewhere below them, sending a faint vibration through the floor. My father sealed these chambers before I took the throne, Adrian said. Victor claimed they held nothing but forgotten records. Eleanor touched one of the symbols. Dust fell away, revealing the outline of a crowned moon. He lied, she said. At the bottom of the staircase they entered a circular room filled with shelves, sealed chests, and portraits turned toward the wall. Victor stood beside a stone pedestal, the black object resting in his open palm. Its dark light had begun to fade. "You should have remained upstairs," he said. His polished courtesy was gone. The court was finally prepared to fear you again. Adrian stopped between Victor and Emma. "You placed this curse beneath my home. I preserved the order that built your kingdom." Victor glanced at Emma. Women with her mark once shared the power of kings. They questioned councils, changed laws, and gave ordinary people a voice. "My ancestors understood the danger." Emma moved toward one of the covered portraits and turned it around. A woman with chestnut hair stood beside a black wolf, white fire resting in her hands. Her face carried the same gray-blue eyes Emma saw in her own reflection. Beneath the painting, a small brass plate read Queen Evelyn Whitmore, Guardian of the Moon Crown. Emma's breath caught. "Whitmore," she whispered. Eleanor opened a nearby record book. The pages described healers, protectors, and queens whose gifts had been erased from official history. Victor's family had called their power a curse, then taught future generations to fear every girl who carried the mark. "My family did not inherit shame," Emma said. "They inherited a lie." Victor closed his fingers around the black stone. A useful lie. One that kept power where it belonged. The light along Emma's wrist brightened. She did not feel anger. She felt the weight of every woman hidden, every child silenced, and every act of kindness mistaken for weakness. She placed her hand over the crowned moon carved into the pedestal. White light flowed across the chamber, gentle but unstoppable. The black stone dimmed completely. Above them, the ancient records opened as if stirred by a warm wind, revealing names that had been buried for centuries. Victor stared at the powerless stone in his hand. Adrian summoned the guards. "He will answer before the full court," he said. "Every record will be restored." When they returned to the great hall, the nobles were waiting. Victor confessed beneath the gaze of the kingdom, not because he feared punishment, but because Emma's light had awakened the truth sealed within the citadel itself. Adrian then stepped down from the throne and stopped before her. Slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee. "They sent you here as something to be surrendered," he said. "I will not claim what was never theirs to give." He held out his hand, palm open. "Stay not as my tribute but as my equal. Help me rebuild what their lies destroyed." Emma looked at the gathered court, then at the man kneeling before her without command or expectation. She placed her hand in his. "I will stay," she said. "But first we return to Whitmore." 2 days later, the gates of Whitmore Park opened before the royal procession. Emma rode beside Adrian beneath a clear winter sky, no chains around her wrists and no fear lowering her gaze. Villagers gathered along the road as wagons of grain, medicine, and firewood followed behind them. Thomas waited outside the main house with Margaret and Claire. For the first time he bowed to his daughter. "Emma," he said, his voice unsteady. "I was wrong." She looked at the cottage where she had spent 12 hidden years, then at the children watching from the village square. "You were afraid," she replied. "But you made your fear my burden." Thomas lowered his eyes. Margaret stepped forward. "Victor deceived us. We believed the mark was dangerous." "You believed what allowed you to be cruel without feeling guilty," Emma said gently. Her calmness carried more weight than anger. Adrian stood beside her, silent and steady, giving her the space to decide what justice would mean. Emma turned toward the assembled pack. "The Whitmore family will no longer control these lands. A council chosen by the people will govern with protection from Nightcrest. No child will be hidden because of a gift. No family will lose food because its leaders value pride more than mercy." Claire's eyes filled with tears, but she smiled. Weeks later, the great hall of Nightcrest shone beneath thousands of white flames. Restored portraits of the Moon Queens lined the walls, their names spoken aloud for the first time in generations. Emma stood before the throne in a silver gown, her mother's hairpin resting above her heart. Adrian approached with the ancient crown held in both hands. He did not place it on her head. Instead, he set it upon a velvet cushion and stepped back. The choice was hers. Emma looked across the hall at Samuel, Eleanor, Claire, and the people who had traveled from every pack in the kingdom. Then she lifted the crown herself. The moment it touched her hair, white light flowed through the citadel, warming every tower and courtyard without burning a single thing. Beyond the walls, wolves raised their voices beneath the moon. Adrian lowered his head before her, not as a king surrendering his strength, but as a man honoring hers. Emma reached for his hand. She had not been rescued from weakness. She had survived the lies meant to hide her power. They had called her cursed because they feared her light. Adrian Blackwood was simply the first man strong enough to stand beside it.